So we left him, and he was still a little baby, pulled from the reeds by the riverbed. We learned a good lesson last week about overcoming our fears and what it takes to have the kind of courage and the kind of faith in God that it took to be Moses' mom and those women who listened to a greater power and believed that God would do something, even if they could not see what it was that God would do. And now, many, many, many years later, we encounter Moses the man. In chapter 2 of Exodus, Moses is about 40 years old. Moses has led an extraordinary life. He has been raised in Pharaoh's court as Pharaoh's grandson, well-educated. All of the extravagances have been shared with him. He's well-educated. He's got all of the riches that a young man could possibly imagine. No expense has been spared on him. But he is also aware that he is from humble beginnings, that his people, the Hebrew people, are not experiencing the same kind of life that he's experiencing. They, in fact, are being treated very poorly by the same people who are lavishing great wealth and power and prestige upon him. And so he finds himself wanting to go and see for himself what is going on with his people. One day he wanders away from the royal court and comes upon an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave for not performing to the utmost of the Egyptian taskmaster's desire. And in anger, Moses beats him, kills him, and then chooses to hide his dead body. The next day, we hear in chapter 2 that he comes across two Hebrews who are arguing, and he tries to get them to stop arguing, and they say, "So what are you going to do? Kill us like you killed the Egyptian?" And he realizes that although he thought he had been undetected, no one had seen what had gone on the day before. He had been noticed. A word had already gotten around, and we hear that Pharaoh had sought to kill him. And so he escapes to Midian. Now, Midian was a distant location from where he was being raised in Egypt, and actually was a location that had been migrated by the very people that were descendants of Abraham's second wife, Keturah. So that is who he comes upon when he goes to Midian. When he goes to Midian, he comes upon some young women who were trying to water their sheep at a well. And, 40 years old, was not quite that young, but nonetheless, he's a guy, and he sees some young women watering their sheep at a well, and so obviously he pays a little attention, and yet within moments, he notices that some other shepherds come and try and get them out of the way because, they're just women at a well, and they're men, and so they treat the women poorly, and he stands up for them, once again standing on behalf of justice, and makes the other men leave so that the women can continue watering their sheep. One of the women's name is Zipporah, and she tells her father later on that this man does this for them. And the dad says, we hear at first, his name is Ruel, that he had come in and he had saved them from this unkindness. And he said, well, why didn't you invite him to dinner? And so the women go out and they do. Eventually, she is given to him in marriage. And thus begins the second phase of Moses' life. He's 40. The first 40 years of his life, he's raised in the Egyptian court, and where he's well educated, given all sorts of advantages of all of the traditions and all the education he would need to know how to lead as a well-educated man. And now the next 40 years, he is takes a different kind of step around the ladder, and he is a shepherd for his father-in-law. His father-in-law is called for most of the time by another name, Jethro, and he's tending Jethro's flocks. And during this 40-year phase of Moses' life, he learns different lessons. And these lessons are how to learn how to survive in a very desolate landscape. Sherry and I were poking around to look for escapes that kind of look like the kind of terrain that Moses would be trying to attend his sheep on. There are minor oases in this landscape, but a lot of it is just barren land. I mean, this wasn't just haphazardly chosen for the background for PowerPoint. We chose this background for PowerPoint because a lot of the land where Moses was trying to feed his sheep, take care of the sheep, looks like this, just kind of barren desert land, wilderness. And you learn a lot when you're trying to take care of your sheep in this barren land. And so he is, for these 40 years, learning survival skills, which will also teach him a lot for the third phase of his life. And so as he's nearing his 80th year, he comes upon a burning bush. Now, as Marin said, it wasn't burning, but there was fire all around it. And so Moses is curious, not surprisingly, and tries to approach it, and hears a voice coming from it, and is told that it is God, and that God is upset about the treatment of his people. And you know, that's why Moses is there out in this barren wilderness. I mean, he had been living in the lap of luxury. Moses is in this very wilderness because he too was upset about the treatment of the Jewish people. His people had been mistreated by the Egyptians. He could bear it no longer. He couldn't live this kind of double life in which he was living in the lap of luxury, watching the people that were his ancestors being mistreated. And now God is saying, I can't stand it that your people are being mistreated, and now you have to go. And he goes, what, me? And he says, you know, how am I supposed to do that? And so we come upon in chapter 3, the Lord says to him, you know, I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, Jacob's God. But Moses was afraid to look at God. And he goes on to ask him, you know, like, well, are the people going to believe me? Is it, you know, what proof do I have? Because you know, Moses hasn't been raised with this kind of relationship with God. He's been raised with the Egyptian gods. And what we see in chapter 3, in verse 14, when he says, you know, what name am I supposed to tell these people? What's the name of this God? What am I supposed to say? And he says, I am who I am. You know, this is God's identity. I am. I am being, I am substance, I am all. The first part of his life, 40 years, he lives in luxury. 40 years he's living in the wilderness. This man is 80 years old. I'd like us to pause for a moment. You know, we kind of like jump ahead oftentimes in our memory, in our thoughts as Christians of Moses. And we think a lot about the Exodus time. And we know the burning bush story, but we jump. You know, we kind of jump over the story that he's killed someone, and the impact that would normally have on our psyches about what happens when someone takes someone else's life. And we know that last week we talked a lot about how God works to bring about God's purposes through other people. And we saw how it was with the two midwives, how he brought about his purposes to save Moses' life. We know how he worked through Moses' mother to save Moses' life, and how he used his sister Miriam to save Moses' life. And all these people came together to bring about the saving of Moses so that Moses could go forth and eventually save his people. And we even talked a little bit about how Joseph's life had been saved. And now here we're in this other place about how God is going to be working through Moses. And so these other circumstances had happened. God was looking at Moses as a person who had stepped up for justice. Now, I'm not saying that God wanted him to take the life of the Egyptian. I'm kind of hoping in my heart of hearts that Moses had just meant to knock him out of the way. That's my little Pollyanna. But Moses had just kind of meant to knock him out of the way and get him to stop beating the Hebrew slave. But, whatever that was, I can't speak the truth. I can just tell you what the Bible says. But God wanted the kind of person who was trying to stop injustice, and he saw that in Moses. And then he also saw in Moses the person who continued to want to stop injustice when he went to this foreign land and saw these women being mistreated, and was once again willing to step up against all these men who were trying to push them away from the well. And so he approaches them many years later in the wilderness, because about 40 years had passed again. But he's an 80-year-old man. Do you kind of notice that? Now, I'm going to ask you to out yourself. If you're in the vicinity of 80, could you raise your hand? Okay. How many of you in the vicinity of 80 want to lead about, I'm going to be conservative, 300 people on a mission trip for 40 years? No? Not even you? No, Dwayne? Huh? A retired pastor? No? Well, 40 years in the wilderness. Like, he is spending, that's beyond golden years. Okay, he's spending from like 40 to 120 leading these grumbling people in the wilderness because he's taking them out of slavery. This is God. He's fulfilling God's purposes. So, let's be a little kind on Moses and some of his transgressions is what I try to get my heart to embrace. But, at 80 years old, he is beginning the third phase of his life. What God has asked him to do is go to the person who has sought to take his life for killing an Egyptian. I'm sure his grandpa was mad that he kind of betrayed the family by killing an Egyptian to save a Hebrew. And so he's going to go back there and say, now let my people go. I'm sure Grandpa wasn't going to look real favorably upon that. Who's going to look happy about that? And God wants him to go do that. I'm 80 years old. I've already really had this fabulous life for 40 years walking around in that desert trying to get water and food to a bunch of sheep that my father-in-law figures I can keep alive. And I'm going to go say, can I do this? And I've just spoken to a burning bush. At 80 years old, I might think I'm senile. There's a lot of things I might be thinking at 80 years old. Have I been in the sun too long today? I like to think about what Moses is embracing. This is the man, and the other part that we didn't touch on last week, but I want you to realize, for the Jewish people, our brothers and sisters who are Jewish, to this day, this is the person they revere. This is the most important person for the Jewish people. Because we have Jesus, they're still holding on to Moses as the person who brought their people out of slavery. They're still waiting on the Messiah, but for them, this is their main guy. And so their main guy has a major role in leading their people and their salvation history. And so Moses is at this very big turning point in his life, but there are these two critical moments in his life where he, one, kills this taskmaster, and then he encounters the burning bush, and at that burning bush at 80 years old, he agrees to go. He doesn't say, I'm senile, I'm hallucinating, I haven't had enough water to drink today, and go back home. He says, here I am, Lord. And he agrees to go and face Pharaoh. Adam Hamilton, in the book that those of us who are doing the study, calls him the reluctant prophet. And I want to take a moment and invite you to think of the last time someone asked you to serve, do a service project or a mission project, and you were kind of hesitant about saying yes. And I want you to think about, all the reasons why you thought that might not be the thing for you to do. Maybe you really didn't feel equipped to do it. Maybe you could have thought of the 6 other people that you knew were better qualified. Maybe you weren't sure if the people you were going to serving beside, were people you knew, or maybe they might not be your cup of tea, or maybe they wouldn't really accept you to be part of their group, or maybe you were kind of afraid of this new adventure going into this different part of town, different state, different country. I mean, all the different reasons we have when we kind of hold back from saying yes. But think of the time when you were reluctant and then you pushed yourself through and you did it. For those times when we have been reluctant and we kind of make ourselves, I don't know about you, but I know about me, my blessings have been so multiplied. I have found more gift in my work and those projects than I ever could possibly have given to the people I was serving. I have recognized that God has used whatever little ability I had to do that service and provided for me the opportunity to grow. And I think, obviously, that was true for Moses as well. God took this man who, was supposed to have been drowned at birth and raised him and gave him education and then put him out in this barren land for 40 years so he could figure out how, because God knew the Jewish people were going to grumble, so they were going to have to keep circling around for 40 years, and how he was going to keep them alive for 40 years while they were becoming a people. And he was literally forming and transforming them. He was shaping Moses to become the kind of person that could be that kind of leader. God shapes each one of us to do the kind of work that God desires us to do to transform God's kingdom. Not just me, not just a chosen few. Each and every one of us have been shaped to do a particular work to transform God's kingdom. If you haven't thought about what God has done in your life to shape you, or you haven't thought about it for a while, I would invite you to take the time to do so. I had an enormous gift this week. I was invited to attend a CASA breakfast. It's for the court-appointed special advocates. Tiana Haberman invited me to go. She hadn't told me in advance, but she was the 2017 Rookie of the Year. She has served 4 young children over the course of 2017 as their court-appointed special advocate, and she gave a presentation that morning. CASA in Shawnee County, they don't function all the same in all the different counties and all the different states, but in Shawnee County, they function so that the foster kids all have a special advocate, and so that there is a third party who goes to court when there's any case regarding the child, so that no one connected with the state or with the family is speaking, but just a third party is speaking on behalf of the child. And the judge that got up to speak said how important it was for her to have this independent person speak on behalf of the child, because she felt like she was really hearing the child's needs. And I thought about how blessed we were to have someone from our faith community who was serving in that way. I know that each one of you has been gifted. And I know that each one of you has been called. And I'm wondering, where have you seen God at work in your life? And how have you, or how will you answer God's call? That is your challenge. May all the glory be to God. Amen.